The dust hadn't even settled when the silence shattered. One man, 4 sisters. A rifle shot that ended one horror and started another. He was just checking his fence. He didn't plan on being anyone's hero. But when a horse reared above a young girl's skull, Clay Vance pulled the trigger, and with that, his quiet life was over. Part 1. The Shot in the Silence. The sun beat down on the plains like a blacksmith's hammer, trying to flatten every last inch of the high desert. Dust curled up off the trail in pale, choking waves, clinging to everything. Man, horse, thought. Clay Vance rode low in the saddle. Stetson pulled forward, the brim casting shadows over eyes that had long since learned not to meet the world's gaze. His shirt was sweat-soaked, dried stiff, and wet again. 60 acres of dust and stubborn fence posts waited behind him, his little piece of nowhere, carved out by solitude and silence. He kept to himself for a reason. Too many ghosts, too many regrets. He wasn't looking to save anybody. And yet, the scream still came. First a shout, angry, desperate, then a sob so raw it carved straight through bone. Clay's horse slowed, ears flicking. He held still. Then the crack of a rifle split the stillness. Old reflexes, buried deep, surged forward. He spurred the gelding up the ridge and peered over the edge of a shallow ravine. What he saw below made his gut turn to stone. A busted wagon. One body in the dust, and 4 girls, young, terrified, being shoved and cursed by 3 men with tin stars too shiny, too false. Their hands were bound, their dresses torn. They stumbled as they were forced toward waiting horses. One of them, smallest of the bunch, fell, her shoulder bare where the fabric had ripped. A horse reared above her, its hooves pawing the air. She didn't scream, just froze, arms over her head, waiting for it. Clay didn't think. He acted. His rifle rose, smooth as breath. The first shot dropped the rider clean from the saddle. Dust kicked up by his boot as he fell. A bullet zipped past Clay's own spur. He slid from the saddle, rolled behind a flat of rock, and fired again. Sharp, fast, deadly. Another man went down with a thud that didn't echo. The third and last outlaw wheeled his horse and bolted, dust boiling behind him. Silence returned. Clay stayed low, rifle at the ready, eyes sweeping the ridge. Below, the girls huddled together, shaking, blood and dirt and fear clinging to them like another skin. He rose slowly, hands wide of his belt. "You're safe now," he said. The eldest stepped forward. Her braid was heavy with dust, falling over one shoulder, half hiding the rip in her dress. She held the torn fabric with tired dignity. "My name's Eliza," she said. "These are my sisters, Cora, Tess, May." Clay nodded once. "Clay Vance." They stared, waiting to see if he was just another threat in a different skin. He wasn't. "Those men," Eliza said, jaw clenched, "were delivering us. Said we were bought by a judge, Fort Arroyo. We belong to him now." Clay's hands curled into fists. He'd seen what men like that called justice. He'd seen the law twisted into shackles. "No one belongs to a man like that," he said, voice low as thunder. Cora's voice cracked. "If you leave us, they'll come back." Clay looked at the ground. His land needed him. The fences, the cattle. He didn't go looking for trouble. But if he turned his back now, it'd be the same as leaving that girl under the hooves. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Red Mesa Crossing is half a day's ride. Sheriff there can help." "And you?" Eliza asked. "I'll see you there." No more, no less. He cut their ropes gently, helped them onto the outlaws' horses without lingering touch or sideways glances. Respect weighed more than comfort. They rode in silence. 4 women, bruised and broken. 1 man, quiet and grim. and behind them, the dust hung in the air like smoke from a fuse that had just been lit. If this story's got you gripping the edge of your seat, don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a second. The West is wild. But this story's just getting started. The sun was barely off the horizon when they reached the town's edge, dust trailing behind their horses like smoke from a fire that hadn't finished burning. Red Mesa Crossing looked harmless enough. Just a handful of squat buildings crouched along a dirt road, some strung with laundry, others with men already nursing whiskey on porches that creaked under the weight of tired wood and tired eyes. Clay Vance slowed his horse. The four girls clustered tighter behind him, skirts trailing, eyes low. Their silence wasn't fear anymore. It was armor. Towns like Red Mesa didn't make room for folks who didn't fit neat into their boxes. He swung out of the saddle in front of the sheriff's office. The paint on the sign was flaked and sun-bleached, like it hadn't been touched since the war ended. A man stood leaning on the doorframe, arms crossed over a belly that strained his vest buttons. Tin star crooked on his chest, mustache yellowed from too much chew. Sheriff Royce. "Vance," the man said. "Heard you had some excitement." "Found 'em west of the arroyo," Clay said, jerking a thumb toward the sisters. 3 men, armed, claimed they were taking these girls on behalf of someone named Judge Silas. Royce looked past Clay, eyes lingering too long on the girls' torn dresses. His smile didn't touch his eyes. "That right?" "They were tied up," Clay added, voice turning iron, "and one's near got her skull crushed under a goddamn horse." The sheriff stepped down off the porch. He moved slow, chewing on something bitter. "Where are the papers?" Clay frowned. "What papers?" Royce tapped the star on his chest, then motioned with his chin at the girls. "Men you killed worked for the judge. Legal transaction. Signed and sealed. Those girls were bought, Vance. This town may be dusty, but we ain't lawless. They belong to the judge." Cora flinched. Tessa's nostrils flared. Eliza didn't move, only her jaw set, tight enough to crack molars. "They ain't cattle," Clay said. Royce's smile widened like a man enjoying the punchline before it lands. "Law don't make much room for feelings out here. You broke a deal, friend. That makes you responsible." He let that hang in the air like a snake coiled on a branch. "Eliza," Clay said, voice low. She stepped forward. "We belong to no man," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Royce chuckled. "Tell that to the judge. He'll be here in a few days, unless—" His eyes swung back to Clay. "Unless you want to fix it proper. Law says, if you take responsibility for a woman like that, she's yours." Clay's stomach turned to stone. "All of them?" he asked. "That's the law, all 4. Marriage, food, care, safety, for life. You refuse, they go back to Silas, and you'll wish you hadn't interfered." Clay didn't answer right away. He stared past the sheriff to the saloon down the road, then to the rusted bell on the church steeple. He felt it again, that tightness in his chest, like he couldn't quite draw breath. This was that night all over again, the night he failed to act, when someone else paid the price. But this time, it wasn't too late. He looked at the girls. Eliza met his gaze with quiet defiance. Cora's eyes brimmed but didn't spill. Tess looked like she'd punch the world if it moved wrong. And May? May didn't blink. Her whole future was written in the way she looked at him. Clay turned to Royce. "I'll take responsibility." The words didn't come easy, but they came clean. A murmur rolled down the street. Doors creaked open. Eyes peeked through lace curtains. The town smelled blood. "You heard him," Royce said, hollering. "By the law of Red Mesa Crossing, Clay Vance is now the husband of Eliza, Cora, Tess, and May." He winked. "Congratulations." Clay ignored him. He turned to the girls. We ride now. No one argued. They mounted up. Clay led, the sisters following like shadows in his wake. They rode out under a sky that had never looked so wide. The road back to the ranch was longer this time, heavy with what they now carried. Eliza rode beside him halfway home. "Why'd you say yes?" she asked. Clay didn't look at her. "Because if I'd said no, I wouldn't be a man worth following." She nodded. Just once. And for now, that was enough. They didn't speak much on the ride back. Dust rose behind them like a ghost they couldn't shake. The girls rode in a tight formation, flanked by Clay like cattle in a storm. May clung to her saddle horn with white knuckles. Cora's eyes flicked side to side, ever watching. Tess stared straight ahead, jaw locked. Eliza rode just behind Clay, her shoulders drawn back, but her silence louder than any scream. The entrance to Red Mesa Crossing hadn't changed in the last hour, but Clay sure as hell had. He thought maybe handing them over to the sheriff would bring relief. Maybe the law, once faced square, would do what was right. But the further into town they rode, the more that hope turned to dust in his mouth. They reached the sheriff's office just as the sun lit the sign like fire. Sheriff Royce was already waiting on the porch, boots up on the railing, hat tipped back like a man who hadn't done a lick of honest work in weeks. He dropped his feet and straightened slowly when he saw them coming, brushing crumbs from his vest like they were guests at supper. "Well, well," he muttered. "Brought 'em back like a prize herd." Clay dismounted. "They need protection." Royce raised a brow. "You shoot 3 men who had papers, that right?" "Those men weren't lawmen," Clay said. "They had fake badges, and they were roughing up 4 girls half their size. That ain't justice." Royce shrugged like a man who'd traded integrity for convenience a long time ago. They worked for Judge Silas, Fort Arroyo. Deal was signed and stamped. Eliza stepped forward. "They dragged us from our home. We didn't agree to nothing." Royce didn't look at her. He spat off the edge of the porch and eyed Clay. "Look, Vance, I get it. You thought you were doing good. Hell, maybe you were. But good don't always fit in the books. The judge paid. These girls, by the law of this territory, are his property." "No," Clay said, his voice low and iron flat. "Not anymore." Royce smirked like a man already planning the next turn of the screw. "You interfered. That makes you responsible. And seeing as this whole thing's gotten messy, I'm obliged to offer you a choice." Clay didn't answer. Royce leaned in, voice quiet enough the girls couldn't hear. "You can walk out of here right now. Wash your hands of this whole damn thing. I'll wire Fort Arroyo. The judge will collect his goods and you'll ride off clean." Clay's jaw tightened. "Or," Royce said, now louder so the whole street could hear, "you take full responsibility." He let the pause linger like a vulture overhead. "Eliza, Cora, Tess, May, all 4, marriage, food, shelter, lawful protection, your burden to carry, for life." There was a beat of stunned silence. Tess made a sharp sound, like a curse swallowed halfway. Cora looked sick. May's lips parted, whispering something only God could hear. Clay felt it in his ribs again, like his own lungs were resisting him. He looked at them. Eliza met his gaze, eyes dark with a pride that had nothing left to lose. Tess refused to blink. Cora's hand trembled as it reached for her sister's. "May." Her stare pinned him like a branding iron, and he saw it again. That moment under the ravine. The way she'd gone still, beneath a horse's hooves, waiting for death. He wouldn't leave her waiting again. He turned back to Royce. "I'll take responsibility." Royce looked amused. "You do realize what that means?" "I do." "You sure? No backing out later. The judge won't." I said I do. A low murmur rolled down the main street like thunder on the horizon. Clay turned to the girls. I've got a ranch not far. It's quiet. You'll be safe there. Eliza looked like she wanted to believe him. Cora didn't say a word. Tess narrowed her eyes. Maybe trust would come later. Maybe not at all. May, though. May nodded. Just once. And it damn near leveled him. They mounted again. No ceremony. No wedding bells. Just a dirt road behind them, and a storm coming somewhere up ahead. As they rode out of Red Mesa, Clay knew one thing like he knew the feel of cold steel in his hand. He wasn't riding alone anymore. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had draped the land in bruised colors: lavender, rust, and ash. The shadows stretched long across the corral fence, and the wind carried that dry, familiar scent of sage and horses. Clay swung off his saddle slow, his joints stiff from the long ride and the weight of the day. The sisters hesitated. The cabin was small, built for one man, not 5 souls trying to outrun a nightmare. The porch creaked beneath Clay's boots as he unlocked the door, pushed it open, and let the lamplight spill onto the dust-swept floor. He stepped back. "You're safe here," he said simply. Eliza moved first. She crossed the threshold without a word, shoulders high, head held like a woman refusing to be small. Tess followed close, eyes darting to every corner. Cora entered with careful steps, arms crossed tight. May lingered last. She turned once, looking behind her like the trail might swallow her up, then stepped inside. Clay didn't follow. Instead, he walked to the barn, grabbed his bedroll, and spread it in the hay beside the horses. It was warm enough, and even if it wasn't, he figured the girls needed a locked door more than he did. He didn't sleep. Not really. His eyes stayed on the rafters, and his mind circled the same storm. 4 women with no home, no protection, and a piece of paper that said they were his wives. The law might have called it marriage, but to him it felt more like a bargain struck in desperation, with guilt pounding the gavel. At dawn, he was up, feeding the horses and checking the corral gate. The boards needed mending, just like everything else. He caught movement at the house and turned to see Eliza standing in the doorway, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, hair still braided from the day before. "We'll cook," she said. Not an offer, a statement. "Stove's yours," Clay replied. Inside, the girls moved like shadows, quiet, unsure, but determined. Cora boiled beans. Tess found a broom. May sat at the edge of a chair, eyes always watching. Clay kept his distance. When the food was ready, they ate around the table in a silence so heavy it could have been nailed to the walls. That afternoon, he rode into town for supplies. He returned with cloth, flour, salt, and 5 sets of sturdy dresses. Plain, but whole. The sisters unpacked the goods like they were foreign treasures. May touched the cotton like she didn't quite believe it was real. Later, as Clay was unloading feed at the barn, a shadow broke from the edge of the pasture. A rider. Well-dressed, clean boots, a horse that cost more than Clay's whole spread. Clay didn't reach for his rifle, but he kept his hand near it. The man reined in smooth. "Clay Vance?" "I am." "I represent Judge Silas," the man said, his voice slick as creek water. "I'm here for what's his." Clay's mouth tightened. "They're under my protection. They're my wives now, by law." The emissary smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That law don't carry far, Mr. Vance. Judge Silas, he's not the forgettin' type." Clay stepped forward, boots grinding gravel. "Then he best remember this. If he sends men, they better come ready." The emissary adjusted his gloves. "I'll pass along your words." He turned his horse and rode out, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. That night, Clay sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The girls were inside, the door bolted, lamplight flickering behind the curtain. Eliza opened the door just enough to speak. "Is it over?" "No," Clay said, his voice rough. "It's just begun." By the time the emissary's dust settled behind the ridge, Clay knew his quiet life was over for good. That night, the wind howled through the porch beams like an old dog warning of trouble, and the air carried the brittle scent of gun oil and mesquite. Clay didn't sleep in the barn this time. He didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes on the tree line, listening for hoofbeats that hadn't come. Yet. Inside the cabin, the sisters barely moved. May cried once in her sleep, just a whimper, but it cut through the dark like a scream. Tess stayed up sharpening a kitchen knife with a flat stone. Cora curled tight on her bedroll, whispering prayers to no one in particular, and Eliza sat stiff in a chair, one hand resting on the wooden bolt of the door, as if holding it shut with will alone. Come morning, no one spoke of the night. Fear had already taken up too much room. Clay made coffee, poured it without asking who wanted some. The smell filled the cabin, bitter and grounding. "We can't stay scared," he said. "That man ain't the kind who gives up." Eliza nodded. "What do we do?" Clay looked at them. Each one tired, raw, hollowed out but still standing. It stirred something deep, something older than law or blood. They weren't just 4 women anymore. They were his responsibility. "We work," he said simply. That day, the ranch came alive in a way it hadn't since Clay first built the damn place. He handed out tasks like rations, gentle, clear, without bark or bite. Eliza helped him patch the roof on the second room, arms steady even when the wind kicked dust in her face. Cora swept the floors and boiled fresh wash water. Tess hauled hay with a scowl and surprising strength. And May, quiet, careful May, collected eggs and fed the chickens, her hands trembling only a little. Clay moved among them like a shadow, watching, fixing, lifting when needed. He didn't give orders, just space, just respect. He could feel the shift happen, slow and small, a sideways glance that didn't carry fear, a question asked instead of assumed, the first bite of cornbread passed without hesitation. They were still strangers, but they weren't alone. That evening, Clay was hammering in a fresh plank on the fence line when he heard it. Soft footsteps behind him. He didn't turn. "You always fix things with your hands?" Eliza asked. "It's easier than fixing what's in my head," he replied. She stood beside him, watching the sun hang low over the far hills. "My mama used to say a man can hide behind work, but not forever." Clay paused, the hammer heavy in his grip. "I ain't hiding, just trying to keep us alive." Eliza studied his face a long beat. "You're doing more than that." He didn't answer, didn't have to. That night, around the fire, the sisters sat a little closer together. The wind had settled. Clay handed around bowls of beans and cornbread, and for the first time, Cora smiled. It wasn't big, but it was real. After supper, Clay walked toward the barn to check the horses. May followed. She stood in the doorway, her bare feet silent on the packed dirt floor. He turned, half surprised. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "I thought when you killed those men," she whispered, "you might be just like them." Clay lowered his gaze. "But you're not," she said, voice firmer now. "You don't take, you give." He swallowed hard, throat raw from dust and words he didn't know how to say. "I ain't perfect." No, May said, stepping back into the shadows. But you're enough. And then she was gone. That night, Clay stood on the porch until the moon rose. The stars burned like cold fire above him, and the coyotes howled somewhere past the ridgeline. Inside, 4 women slept behind a bolted door, and for the first time, it felt less like a burden and more like a vow. The sun rose over dry hills, painting everything gold and hard. Clay stood at the edge of the corral, pitchfork in hand, watching the dust swirl up under the hooves of his mare. She was restless, and he couldn't blame her. Everything on the land felt like it was waiting. Tight, still, the way it gets right before a storm or a bullet. Inside the cabin, the girls were waking slow. Cora stretched and rubbed her shoulder where sleep had knotted it. Tess was already up, boiling water. May sat by the hearth, combing her fingers through her tangled hair. And Eliza? Eliza moved through the house like she belonged to it, quiet and firm, the way a tree takes root without asking. Clay came in with an armful of kindling. We'll need to head into town. Eliza looked up. What for? Supplies, he said. Clothes that fit. Ammunition, too. The room went still at that last word. They sent a messenger. That means Silas ain't finished. Cora paled. Tess folded her arms. Let him come. But it was May who spoke what they were all thinking. If he comes, do we stay and fight? Clay didn't answer right away. Then, you'll have the choice. But if it comes to blood, I won't let him take you. They rode into Red Mesa before noon, 5 deep. The streets were quiet, but not still. Folks turned their heads. Women pulled their children closer. Men spat and looked away. News had traveled fast, and stories always twisted uglier when passed mouth to mouth. At the general store, Clay helped the girls pick what they needed. Work dresses, boots, soap, flour, stitching thread. He said little, just paid what was owed, and nodded when the shopkeep called him Sir, like it tasted sour. But the real trouble waited outside. A man on a dark bay gelding sat parked in the middle of the street, polished boots resting easy in the stirrups, coat pressed, hat clean. Everything about him looked wrong for this part of the world. He didn't speak until the girls stepped onto the boardwalk. You Vance? Clay's hand drifted near his hip. That's right. The man's smile was all tooth. Judge Silas sent his regards, and a warning. The girls froze behind him. Clay didn't flinch. You already gave one. This one comes with a name, the man said. 3 days, that's how long you got to send the judge's property back. They ain't property, Clay said. They're under my roof, and by law they're my wives. The emissary leaned forward. Judge Silas don't lose. He don't forget, and he sure as hell don't forgive. Clay stared him down. Then he better come ready for something worse than loss. The man clicked his tongue, turned his horse, and rode off down the street like he'd just delivered scripture. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Not from fear. At least, not only. But from that heavy quiet that settles over folks who know something's coming, and who've got too much pride to say they're scared. When they reached the house, Clay handed Eliza the rifle from the saddle scabbard. You know how to shoot? She nodded. Good. You'll need to teach the rest. Cora blinked. You mean, us? I ain't the only one worth fighting for in this house, he said. Tess smirked. The first hint of light all day. About damn time. That night, Clay dragged out an old trunk from the loft. Inside were Mary's clothes, his sister's, packed away since she died of the fever. He hadn't touched them in years. But now, they meant something more. These'll do until we can stitch better ones, he said. Eliza ran her fingers along the fabric. "We'll take care of him." "I know," Clay said. After supper, the sky turned pink and bruised. The air was quiet. Too quiet. Clay was out front stacking firewood when Royce rode in, dust trailing behind him like a warning bell. The sheriff dismounted and stepped up close. "I heard Silas's man showed up." "He did. And? And I ain't backing down." Royce scratched his jaw. "Then we got work to do." Clay frowned. "You switching sides?" "No," Royce said. "I'm backing the truth. I'll need statements. Signed ones, about what happened." He looked toward the house. "You get their words in writing. It's the only thing that'll hold up when this goes legal." Clay nodded slowly. Royce mounted back up. "They've got a voice now, Clay. Make sure it's loud enough to matter." And with that, he rode into the night. Inside, Clay gathered them around the table. The lantern light flickered over their faces. 4 women. Tired, haunted, but not beaten. "Tell me everything," he said, setting pencil and paper on the wood. Eliza was first. Then Tess. Then Cora. When May spoke, her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. By the time the last word was written, Clay's hand ached, but his jaw was set like stone. "You got no one left to speak for you," he said quietly. "So now you got me." And they believed him. For the first time, they truly did. 3 days passed. No riders came. Not the judge. Not his men. Not even a damn scout. Just the wind, scraping dust along the fence posts like a warning that wouldn't speak plain. Inside the house, the girls kept busy, though work couldn't chase the thoughts they carried. Eliza wrote and rewrote their statements by lamplight, neat and clear. Tess fashioned a makeshift barricade behind the front door with sacks of seed and water barrels. Cora read the Bible aloud in the mornings, sometimes with fire in her voice, sometimes so soft you had to lean close to hear. And May stood lookout every dawn, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the ridge like it owed her an answer. Clay watched it all. He didn't speak much, but he didn't rest either. He kept the rifle by the door, a loaded shotgun over the hearth, and a Colt under his coat. Because Judge Silas wasn't just a man, he was a storm in human skin, and Clay had seen storms flatten better men. On the 4th day, Royce rode up again, dust on his boots and something sharp behind his eyes. "Clay," he said, swinging off the saddle, "you better sit down." Clay didn't move. "Say it." Royce took off his hat, glanced at the house. "Silas filed charges. Says you're harboring stolen property. Claims the girls are wards of the court under contract, and you—" "I married them," Clay said, voice hard. "Doesn't matter to him. He got a federal judge to sign off on a writ. He's coming with marshals. Might even bring soldiers, Clay." Inside, a chair scraped. Eliza stood in the doorway. "Soldiers?" she asked. Royce nodded, pained. "They say it's lawful seizure." "Lawful?" Tess barked a laugh. "There ain't a damn lawful thing about what he did to us." Royce looked away. That night, the house turned into something else. A place bracing for war. Clay taught them to load the guns, showed them how to fire, to aim low, to reload with calm hands. Even May, whose fingers trembled like spring water, pulled a trigger before dusk. They cooked double that night, stocked jars, packed dry biscuits and strips of venison into old flour sacks. The barn held the rest, just in case they had to ride fast. Eliza sat beside Clay on the porch long after the stars blinked into being. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I do." "You didn't ask for this trouble." "I didn't ask for much," Clay replied. "Never expected to find anything worth protecting." He looked at her then. Really looked. And she didn't look away. I meant what I said, he added. I'm not handing you over. She touched his arm, gentle. Then let's make it count. At dawn, they came. Not soldiers. Not yet. Just 2 men on black horses, clean coats and silver stars that meant Washington's blessing. U.S. Marshals. They stopped at the gate. Clay walked out alone. You Clay Vance? The taller one asked. That's right. We're here under writ from the circuit judge out of Santa Fe. These women belong to Judge Silas Gant by indenture and bond. They don't belong to anybody, Clay said. The man pulled a paper from his coat. You'll either comply or face consequences under federal obstruction and harboring statutes. Clay didn't even look at the writ. You tell your judge, he said, stepping forward, voice low and deadly. He can drag God and hell behind him, and I'll still be here. The marshal narrowed his eyes. This'll be the only warning. Then you've given it. The men turned and rode back, raising dust all the way to the ridgeline. Back in the house, Eliza shut the door behind him. They'll come harder next time, she said. I'm counting on it. May stood by the fire, clutching her mother's locket like a talisman. What do we do now? Clay moved to the center of the room. We draw lines, we dig in, and when they come, we don't run. Tess loaded shells into the shotgun. They picked the wrong house. Cora looked up from her Bible. If we die here. Clay cut her off. We ain't dying. And he meant it, because this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about dignity, justice, something the law had forgotten but his gut hadn't. It was about choosing what kind of man he'd be at the end of it all, and he wasn't about to bend his knee to another tyrant who wore a judge's robe. Not while he still had breath. The morning wind came dry and mean, kicking grit across the porch steps and rattling the windows like bones in a tin cup. Clay stood out front, hat low, watching the trail with squinted eyes. He didn't need a clock to know they were late. Silas Gant never came when expected. He came when it hurt. Inside, the girls moved like soldiers now. The week had aged them. Cora wore a pistol on her hip like she'd been born to it. Tess walked the perimeter every hour, checking the fence lines, eyes sharp as hawk glass. Eliza kept a ledger of supplies. May barely spoke. But when she did, her voice no longer trembled. At sundown, the dust rose again. A long line of riders, 6 men, clean-shaven and mean-eyed, with rifles across their saddles. At the center, on a black gelding with a white blaze down its face, sat Silas Gant, judge of the territory, and butcher in a silk vest. He smiled as he dismounted, boots polished and slow. Mr. Vance, he said, voice syrupy and cold, you've made quite the fuss. Clay didn't move. You're trespassing. Silas looked past him, toward the porch where Eliza now stood. She didn't flinch when their eyes met. They're not yours, Clay said. No, they belong to the court. They belong to no one. Silas chuckled like he'd heard that line before. You think this ends with a standoff, blacksmith? Think the law cares about sentiment? Clay's voice dropped. You ever see what happens when a cornered man stops being afraid? That silenced Silas for a beat. Then, with a flick of his hand, one of the riders stepped forward and tossed a leather-bound folder at Clay's feet. Official condemnation, Silas said. I now own this land, through back taxes and jurisdictional decree. Eliza's voice rang from the porch. You forged that. Darlin', I wrote the laws you're citing. Tess was already loading the shotgun. Clay didn't reach for his pistol. Not yet. His eyes didn't blink. This land don't scare me, Silas went on. But you made me look like a fool. You made them believe they could just walk away. That can't stand. He leaned close. And when I come back tomorrow, I'll bring more than papers. That night, the house bristled with silence. They didn't speak during supper, didn't pray, just chewed stale biscuits and stared into the fire. Then Cora pushed back her chair. We can't win, can we? We don't have to, Eliza said. We just have to outlast him. May finally broke her silence. He's gonna burn it down. Clay looked up. Then we let him try. Before dawn, they dug trenches behind the barn. Tess stacked bottles filled with kerosene and cloth. Eliza drew up plans on old seed paper, escape paths, fallback zones, defensible corners. By mid-morning, Royce showed up again, hat in hand, face grim. I can't stop him, he said. The federal marshal's riding with him this time. They got cavalry permission. 2 wagons full of men waiting outside town. You here to warn me? Clay asked. No, Royce said. I'm here to choose. That earned him a look. Royce set a worn pistol on the table. You stood alone too long, Clay. I figure it's time someone stood beside you. Clay didn't say thank you, but his eyes softened a fraction. They spent the rest of the day packing essentials, just in case they had to flee. The sky above them darkened early, thick with smoke from a fire set somewhere upriver. A warning or a message. Maybe both. When the girls went to sleep, Clay sat on the porch steps alone, whittling a scrap of mesquite wood with his penknife. Royce joined him. You scared? Royce asked. Clay shrugged. I've buried worse things than fear. They sat quiet for a while. Then Clay whispered, almost to himself, This ain't just about land or law, it's about worth. Royce nodded. And love? Clay didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. In the black hours before dawn, something cracked in the distance. Gunpowder or lightning, no one could tell. The girls rose, silent, ready. Eliza gripped Clay's arm as he moved to the door. If we die, she said, know this. You gave us back more than freedom. Clay looked at her then, eyes fierce. I ain't dying today. And if fire came, it'd have to walk through every ounce of grit they had left. The morning broke red, not from the sun, but from the smoke rising over the ridge like the sky itself had caught fire. Cora spotted the riders first. They're coming. Clay stepped outside, Colt strapped tight, eyes cold as riverstone. Behind him, Royce loaded shells with sharp, practiced hands. No more talk of law, no more hiding behind paper. This was the day. Tess stood at the barn loft, rifle ready. May carried oil jars to the cellar. Eliza stayed near Clay, always near, her jaw tight, but her eyes full of that same stubborn steel he'd seen in her from the first. They were ready. Across the field, the dust line thickened. 20 riders, 2 wagons, 1 flag, and at the front, Silas Gant. The judge wore black today, not his usual court coat. This was meant to bury something. He didn't stop at the gate. Clayton Vance, he hollered, voice thick with power. By federal decree, you're to surrender the fugitives and vacate the land. Clay stood at the edge of the porch, hands low at his sides. I told you once, he called back. I won't bow to thieves in robes. Silas smiled, and it wasn't human. Then let the fire judge you. He raised his hand. Shots cracked. The first volley missed, but it tore through the front posts and shattered the upper window. Clay ducked back. Royce returned fire, his Winchester barking fast and mean. Tess hit one rider clean off his saddle. The judge's men scattered, circling wide, trying to flank. In the chaos, Clay shouted, Cora, get to the side pen, cut the horses loose if they breach the fence. I'm on it. May dragged a box of shells to the porch, crawling low. They're trying to push us back. Then we push harder, Eliza snapped, reloading like a soldier born. Smoke poured from the barn. One of the riders had tossed a torch. Flames climbed fast. Tess screamed from the loft. "They're burning the barn!" Clay cursed, turned to Royce. "Cover me!" He sprinted through the yard under fire, boots pounding dry dirt, and crashed through the barn door just as sparks lit the hay bales. Inside, 2 of the horses thrashed, eyes wild. Clay slashed the ropes with his knife, slapped their flanks. "Run, damn it, run!" The animals burst out the back, smoke swirling behind them. Clay stumbled out coughing, jacket scorched but alive. Back at the house, the battle turned close. Silas's men tried to rush the porch, but May smashed one across the face with a skillet when he got too close. Eliza fired at near point blank, dropping another. Blood hit the step. Clay saw it, saw her stumble. "Eliza!" She waved him off. "Just a graze." He grabbed her, dragged her behind the doorframe, hands slick with both their blood. Her breathing was sharp but steady. "I'm not quitting," she hissed. "I know," Clay said, "but you stay alive." Royce fell next. Shot through the thigh, he went down with a growl, still firing as he crawled behind a barrel. Clay dragged him clear, propped him against the wall. "Damn fool," Royce muttered through clenched teeth. "Thought you were tired of standing alone." Clay smiled bitterly. "You picked a hell of a day to join." Then the shouting changed. Silas's voice roared from the field. "That's enough! Burn it all!" The men hesitated. "Burn it!" he screamed again. They lit torches. Clay watched, heart sinking. He couldn't stop all of them. He looked to the house, to Eliza, wounded but unyielding, to the girls, black powder on their cheeks and fire in their eyes. And in that moment, he knew. They weren't just defending a house. They were defending the only thing they'd ever been allowed to choose. Clay didn't wait. He stepped into the open, gun drawn, and started walking straight for Silas. Bullets zipped past. One grazed his shoulder. He didn't stop. Silas saw him and sneered. "Finally grew a backbone?" Clay kept walking. "You'll die for them?" Clay raised the Colt. "I lived long enough without them." He fired. Silas flinched too late. The shot hit him clean in the shoulder. He dropped to one knee, howling. Then the girls opened fire again from the house, and the judge's men broke. Some fled, some stayed and bled. None reached the porch. When it was done, the yard was a graveyard of smoke and groans. Clay limped back, shirt torn, blood darkening his side. Eliza met him halfway. "Is he dead?" she asked. "Not yet." Royce spit blood into the dirt. "Maybe let the law see him now." Clay looked around at the ruin. Law's been blind long enough. And behind them, the barn still burned. But the house stood. So did they. The land was quiet now. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that follows something brutal. A hush after a storm, when even the birds won't sing just yet. Clay Vance stood alone at the fence line, his arm still bandaged, hat pulled low against the sun that felt too bright for a day like this. The fields stretched out before him, burned at the edges but still holding. Still breathing. Behind him, the ranch was a patchwork of scars, bullet holes in the siding, blackened timber where the barn used to stand. But the house stood. And so did they. Royce sat on the porch, legs splinted and propped up on a crate. He was whittling something, badly, muttering curses under his breath. Eliza came and went with a limp, her shoulder healing stiff, but her hands were strong as ever. The girls worked alongside her, Cora splitting logs, Tess sewing new curtains, May baking biscuits that turned out like bricks, but warmed the place just the same. They weren't guests anymore. They were something else. Something harder to define, like soil after fire, changed but not destroyed. The law rode in 2 days later. Not from Dry Creek, those men had scattered like cowards, but from Carson Ridge, where someone still remembered what justice was supposed to look like. Sheriff Dobbs took one look at the bodies buried out back and didn't ask a damn thing. Just cuffed what was left of Silas Gant, blood crusted on his coat, and threw him in the wagon. "Man's got a lot to answer for," Dobbs muttered. Clay didn't respond, because the man Silas had truly wronged wasn't him. Later, Royce found Clay by the fire pit, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes. "You know," Royce said, "you could leave now. This fight's done." Clay didn't look up. "Ain't about the fight." "No," Royce said. "It's about them." Clay nodded once. Then he spoke, voice low, almost reverent. "I've seen death. More than I ever wanted. Lost good men, buried my kin under stars I couldn't name. Thought maybe I was cursed to just outlast things. But they didn't need a savior. They needed a place to start over. And somehow so did I." Royce smiled, dry and knowing. "You always were a stubborn bastard." One morning, Eliza joined him at the fence line. She didn't speak right away, just stood beside him, arms crossed, hair braided back with a piece of blue ribbon May had given her. "Do you ever think," she said finally, "that maybe some people aren't meant for peace?" Clay took his time before answering. "I think peace ain't something that comes to you. It's something you decide to make, and hold on to even when it's heavy." "Huh." She looked at him. Really looked at him. Into the cracks he'd spent years trying to plaster over with silence and steel. "Then hold on to this, Clay." And she reached for his hand. That night, the house felt full. Not just with bodies, but with laughter, clanking spoons, warmth. Tess played a tune on the harmonica. Cora tried to harmonize and failed miserably. May dozed off at the table, her head on her arms, safe for the first time in what felt like forever. Clay sat at the edge of it all, listening, not speaking, just being. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The last scene was nothing grand. No riding off into the sunset, no sudden proposal, no redemption written in bold print. Just Clay, alone again at dawn, watching the golden wheat ripple like slow breath. He reached into his coat and pulled out the pocket knife Royce had carved for him. A crude little horse, rough but honest. He smiled, barely. Then he turned back toward the house. Home. Not the place. The people. The choice to stay. Somewhere out there, the West still held men who'd sell lives for coin. Towns still whispered about shame like it was contagious. Land still bled under boots that didn't belong. But not here. Not anymore. Because in this stretch of scorched earth, one man stood and said, "No more running." And sometimes, that's all it takes. Just one man. One fence line. One decision to stay. Would you have stayed? Or ridden on like the wind never touched you? The West don't give answers easy. But maybe, just maybe, it gives you the chance to ask the right question.